Okay, hello everyone. This is Omar Khalid as usual, a Meet the Experts, where we meet from all around the world guests that talk about their books and their research, especially those things that go against mainstream, as you have always seen in my episodes. And this time, as you can see, we have an honored, we are honored with this guest, Dr. Andrew Newberg. So we'd like to welcome him to the show.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's my pleasure, and the dream comes true. I always see you in TV and TikToks and so on, and now it's just one-on-one interview. What an interesting incident.
We have a lot of good things to cover.
Yeah, God willing. So, in the beginning, I would like to tell the viewers that you are Dr. Andrew, Director of Research at Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University. And you have one of the best-selling books, What God Does to Your Brain, and also another new book, which is What Enlightenment Does to Your Brain. Also, we're going to cover all of these things in details, but in the beginning, I would like to ask, if it is a little bit of a personal question. We can see, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in the West, most of the scientists, they don't get near to the religious issue, or this out of the question for most of the people. And
right.
Some of the biologists, they said that, without mentioning the names, that we don't even allow a foot for the divine to get into the labs. So how would you see this view of the West? Is it really fair to say this about the Western view of religion? And the second part of the question, how did you tread on this territory without being afraid?
Sure. Well, I think that there are certainly a lot of scientists who do not feel that there's any room for religion, but I think there's also a large number who do, and I think from my perspective, a lot of my interest in this whole area began when I was a child, and I was just asking questions about the world and the universe and what we can know about it. And I started out thinking that science was going to have answers for everything, and science has a lot of wonderful answers for a lot of different. But I realized that there were certain limitations that science had, and so I started, as I was going through my training, to explore various philosophical ideas, religious and theological ideas, and realized that they had some wonderful things to say about the universe and about the world, but also had certain limitations. And so in my own mind, I guess I came to realize that if we could find a way to bring them together in a way that utilized the best of what science had to offer to tell us about the physical world, the best of what religious and spiritual traditions had to tell us about the other aspects of who we are as human beings, that would really be our most effective way of understanding the world around us. And so for me, I feel that the relationship between religion and science really ideally is a two-way street. It's not just science telling us about religion, it's not just religion telling us about science, but it's how the two of them can come together to help us understand who we are as human beings. And of course, sometimes science will look at religion and sometimes religion will look at science, but I think the more we keep an open dialogue, and I think the more we keep an open mind about it, then we have opportunities to be able to explore things in ways that we haven't been able to do before. We learn about our mind, we learn about consciousness, we learned about our spiritual selves, our biological selves, and all of this hopefully will help humanity to learn who we are and how we should be, and hopefully what we will be in our future.
That's amazing, Dr. Andrew. So basically what you're saying, Dr. Andrew, most of the time, maybe in the West, through the years, in the dark ages, that maybe the church, or some representatives of the church, they persecuted some of the scientists because they talked about things they claim to be against the Bible. Maybe they are not against the Bible, maybe against some interpretations
Right.
of religion. And maybe this is a problem sometimes from the religious side. I'm a Muslim myself, and I want to say it's a mistake to interpret a verse by a theory that maybe it's not even well thought out yet, and to just jump into conclusions because we want to prove this is the truth. And that's why sometimes this can do disservice to religion more than serving the religious values. So what about this in your view? Some people, they take your research and maybe jumped into conclusions in your view, or you see also the other way around, that maybe some atheists, or some maybe, I would like not to say all atheists, but some of them, like maybe the militant atheists, they can just explain it away and say all of the research is just biological manifestation, they are just neurons firing in the head. You don't just think that it goes beyond the like the biological manifestation of it. So what about those two extremes? How do you tackle those two things?
Sure. Well, so, also to talk about the work that I do as a field that has often been referred to as neurotheology. And again, the idea there is that for me, neurotheology is studying the link between religion and science. And as you said, I mean, one of the problems that I encounter at times are people try to interpret information and data in different ways. And part of what I feel is my responsibility is to try to point out to people how far we can go with what different things we can say. So, for example, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, some of the brain scans that we've done of people doing prayer, people doing meditation. So if I have a brain scan of somebody in prayer and they feel that they have connected with God, for example, I can't make an evaluation about that part of the prayer. I can tell you what's going on in their brain when they have that experience, but whether or not they are actually connecting to God is a different kind of question. And so there's still information. I think it's still very interesting to know what's going on in our brain when we feel that happening. And it may have some ultimate implications in terms of the discussion about how we as human beings can feel God, perceive God, connect with God, whatever a person may feel. But it also doesn't reduce it to just what's going on in our biology. Conversely, again, it doesn't prove that God exists simply because I see a change in the brain as well. And so, again, I think what I like to say is that I think this field of neurotheology contributes to the discussion of religion and science in new ways. But we do have to be very careful about how we draw conclusions and what we ultimately can say about these things. And so whether or not we may ultimately find new ways of looking at things or learn something new about how our body and brain work and how our spirit or soul may work, that is always a possibility as well. But I think, again, we always need to, as I like to say, we need to keep science rigorous and do good science, but we need to keep the religious side religious. We need to understand what religious ideas are about and what they mean and how they help us to understand who we are and our world. And so we need to do our best to be careful, but to learn from the information that we have in front of us.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing, Dr. Andrew. So what about like the $1,000,000 question? What does God do to you?
Well, so, again, one of the things that I think is a fascinating question is to explore what religion, what God does for us, to us in ways that we can look at it, not just in the religious way, but also from a bit of a scientific perspective. So, for example, if someone is reading the Quran, for example, well, what are they using? They're using their brain to do the reading. There are language areas of our brain that interpret the words that are there. We have our memory systems. Maybe we read, maybe someone reads a phrase and is reminded of a time when they were a child, when something happened and they had a moral decision that they had to make or something like that. Now you bring in emotions. Do you feel something? Do you feel awe? Do you feel love? Do you feel compassion? And so each of those feelings, each of those cognitive processes are things that are going on in the brain. Now, again, it doesn't eliminate in any way, shape, or form what the religious significance of reading the Quran might be, but it does tell us something about how do we do that? How do we engage it? What happens when somebody develops Alzheimer's disease and they no longer can read or remember things as well? Does that change their sense of religion? Does it change their sense of being spiritual? Does it affect the way that if they can't read the Quran, for example, then what does that mean? And how do we interpret that? So there are a lot of very, very interesting questions that come up that we can use to try to understand how how God is affecting us, how our religious and spiritual beliefs are affecting us. If we do a practice like prayer, what's going on when we do the prayer? Are there ways in which we can do it more effectively or less effectively? And this is something, we can talk about this a little bit later. We wrote a research paper on Muslim prayer, and there's ways in which people can just read a prayer, and then there's other ways in which they can fully engage the prayer. And there are big differences in the brain if you're just saying it for the sake of saying it versus if you're truly engaged in it. And the same is true of going to a mosque, or if there's a difference between somebody who's just sitting there because their parents told them to sit there versus somebody who is really there and really engaged. Plus, the Quran has hundreds of verses and lines. Which are the most important ones to each person? We tend to think that, okay, this is what is supposed to be a certain way, but we never know until we start to ask those questions. And I think science can help us to look at those things in a more systematic way and help us to understand what it really means for each person. When somebody reads the Quran, are they having thoughts? Are they having emotions? Are they having experiences? Are they having all three? And again, there's some wonderful questions for us to ask and answer.
That's amazing. So what about Dr. Andrew, about your research when it comes to, I read two things and I felt like a little bit confused, and maybe you would like to clarify this to the audience. Like the part that when somebody focuses on the prayer and you feel like there is the frontal lobe, which is responsible for, correct me if I'm wrong, for taking decision, for self-control and analyzing things, it lights up more. But there, for some other prayers, or some other, you can say, manifestations of prayer, that little part of this frontal lobe, which is, I think, the basal ganglia, that shuts down. What about those two experiences? What happens in those two experiences?
Well, so you're correct. I mean, in the sense that, so we have, our frontal lobe right behind the forehead, and we've scanned the brains of about 400 or so people doing all different kinds of prayer from all different traditions, and we do find, to some degree, similarities across them, as well as unique characteristics for each of them. And when it comes to doing prayer, several different things can happen. So first of all, when you first begin the process and you're repeating certain phrases or you're saying certain phrases, that tends to activate the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is involved in, as you said, concentration, intention, willful or purposeful behaviors. So anytime you're concentrating on something, you're going to be using your frontal lobes. And so if you're reading from the Quran, if you're saying a prayer, then you are activating your frontal lobes. And this is something that we have seen. But what we also see is that when people, as they go into the prayer, and this to me was part of why I was very excited to study Islam initially. Obviously, one of the fundamental concepts is the notion of surrendering oneself to God. And the idea of surrender, in my neuroscience brain, I said, okay, so what does that mean? And to a large extent, that is kind of giving over your willfulness, your purposefulness. And so when we did study several individuals in Muslim prayer, what we saw was, instead of an increase in frontal lobe activity, we see a decrease. And as the frontal lobe shut down, that sense of I'm trying to make it happen starts to go away, and we feel that it is more happening to us. It is we are surrendering to that process and kind of allowing it to happen instead of making it happen. And so this is it's always fundamental for us to understand what people are feeling. Unless I actually ask them that question as well, I don't know how to interpret the scans that I'm looking at. But as you said, what we find, one of the major things that we find is that some types of practices increase frontal lobe activity, other types actually help it to drop or decrease, and particularly Muslim prayer is one of those particular types of practices where the frontal lobes start to shut down. Now, as you mentioned, there are other areas of our brain, the basal ganglia, as you mentioned, are a very central structure. and they're involved also in concentration, but also in our emotional responses. They help with the release of dopamine in the brain, which is what some people refer to as the feel-good neurotransmitter. So if you're deep in prayer and you have this incredible, positive emotional feeling of love, feeling of joy, happiness, then most likely that's these emotional centers of the brain also kind of kicking in, so to speak, and helping a person to feel that that powerful connection. And incidentally, just going back to your prior question about God changing, how God changes your brain. Another really important point here in the context of looking at the brain itself, as I like to say, for an individual who is religious, it would be almost fundamentally silly if God was up there and we were down here, and we had no way, we had no brain that could read the Quran, could do a prayer, that could understand these ideas. So it makes sense that we would be made with a brain that can do all these things. And then to understand how that happens is, to me, part of what learning and part of what being human is all about, is asking the questions.
So I don't know if you remember this, Dr. Andrew, like in one of the programs, maybe 4 years or 3 years ago, if you remember his name, Ahmed Shaqiri, he made one of the...
what was the name? I'm sorry.
Ahmed Shaqiri. I will just try to remind you that one of the Muslim famous figures. He does some of the programs dealing with the religious stuff and tying this with science. He came to the lab and he prayed. You remember him? So he prayed the Muslim prayer in two ways. The first one was without concentration. It was just the regular routine prayer that maybe most of the people just try to do it to do their duty, and that's it. You don't want to be punished, and that's it. But he just tried the other one, which is with concentration, and even made the crew get out from the room in the second unit of the prayer to concentrate. Right. Your reaction, Dr. Andrew, was basically, you said, I never saw something like this before. So why did you have this reaction?
So, well, I mean, again, to me, that's so fundamental, this idea of what's the difference between simply saying a prayer versus really engaging in the prayer. And what we did see was a very significant change in how the brain works, which made I in some sense, I was hoping to see that. But yes, I mean, it's always amazing when you do see it. And without being overly grandiose, one of the great things about doing research, it's sort of like walking on the moon. No one ever saw it before. So it is the first time that anyone had ever done a brain scan of somebody doing Islamic prayer. And so to see it was very exciting. And to see the pattern, which was, again, a very unique pattern, where the difference really was that his frontal lobes went down fairly substantially. And that was, I had hoped that I might see something like that, but I really didn't know you never know exactly what you're going to do or what you're going to see. But it also really speaks to the fact, and this is something else that I think comes out of our research with Islamic prayer, as well as other types of practices and meditation and things like that, that the more you are engaged in it, the more it is a part of who you are. The stronger, the more powerful that you try and work on doing it, it comes back to you, so to speak. It becomes a more powerful experience. It becomes something that fully engages you. And so I think one of the take-home points is that while maybe once in a while you have no choice but to just do the prayers because you have to do them, to really do them and to really be a part of it and to feel it and to kind of, maybe another way to say it is to wrap your brain around it, is really the most important thing, I think, for people who are religious and spiritual. It is the way that really helps them to truly connect. And it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. I mean, this is the kind of information that we can learn by doing a brain scan, where we can say, yes, while we understand that sometimes you may just have to do the prayers, the more you can do them, the more you can engage it, the stronger you feel it. Just getting, as you said, he got rid of all the distractions and really focused in on that prayer. that was a very powerful experience for him, and it shows up in the way in which his brain and his body ultimately respond.
So what about Dr. Andrew, like after getting out of the lab, like when I come and maybe you do like a brain scan on me, you can see these differences, they manifest themselves. But what about when I get out? Is it temporary or permanent effect?
Right. So it's a little bit of both, actually. So a lot of the studies that we have done have shown that what happens when you're doing the prayer. However, there were some inklings with some other research that showed, for example, that people who had been doing meditation practices, for example, typically like Buddhist type of practices, for many, many years, had differences in their brain compared to people who had not been doing those practices. And so it was one of the questions, though, that came up is, was their brain built that way? And that's why
The chicken or the egg.
meditation was something that was easy for them to, chicken and the egg, exactly. Versus whether or not, their brain had changed over time. And so we actually did one of the first studies, and we followed it up with several other studies that have shown that, in fact, the brain does change over time, even over short periods of time. So one of our studies looked at people doing a very simple, very secular meditation, about 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And it changed the way their brain was working just at rest. And so, and then we did another study of people undergoing a spiritual retreat program, and did again find that there were significant changes in the way the brain was working. So again, the answer to some degree is that we all have a certain kind of genetic built-in predisposition for how we feel about various religious and spiritual ideas. You talked about atheists at the beginning. Is there something going on in their brain that makes them less likely to be able to experience something religious or spiritual, or to accept it? And so, I think that there's a certain degree to that is true. But the more we do these practices, the more it does change our brain. And so, as I like to say about our little study of people doing a 12-minute a day practice for 8 weeks, you can imagine, and if that changes your brain pretty substantially, you can imagine what's going on in someone who is doing a prayer 5 times a day for a lifetime, and so it really does change the parts of our brain, our frontal lobe. It changes another very central part of our brain called our thalamus, which takes a lot of our sensory information. It helps different parts of our brain communicate, and in many ways, the thalamus is part of what helps us to construct our perspective of reality. So if we are doing these kinds of prayer practices and these kinds of meditations, then it literally can change the way our brain works and change the way we think about the reality around us, and incorporate the various ideas and hopefully the positive ideals that are a part of the tradition that make a person a better parent, a better spouse, a better person in society, and hopefully try to make humanity better. But it definitely is something that changes the brain, not just when you're doing it, but there is that long-term effect. Now, one thing we don't know is that if you suddenly stop doing prayer today, what happens? Does it, at some point, those practices will you would start to lose some of that effect over time, but we don't. That's something for a future study.
The amazing thing here, Dr. Andrew, like we have in the Quran, like an order or command from Allah to pray, and there's a connection between prayer and getting away from bad things and sins. Like if you pray, you're going to get out of this. And even Prophet Muhammad, he talked about this when one of the people, he was stealing, and at the same time he used to pray. So Prophet Muhammad, he said to the people, he corrected the notion and told them that this prayer is going to change his behavior. Like, don't judge him and say like he's a bad person and so on. Like maybe this spiritual practice is going to manifest itself in the action and so on.
Right. Well, and one of the cute phrases that we like to say is that the neurons that fire together wire together. I don't know how that will sound in Arabic, but the point is that that the more we use certain neural pathways in our brain, the more they become ingrained in our brain, and the more our behaviors and our thoughts and feelings follow that. So, for example, if you are doing a prayer practice that supports love, compassion, honesty, as an example, then your brain begins to foster brain connections that support love, compassion, and honesty. And so you are more likely to act with love and compassion and honesty. And on the other hand, if you go into prayer and you're praying in a way that espouses hatred or anger, then those are the feelings that are going to become more a part of how you look at the world and how you think about the world. So that's always the double-edged sword, so to speak, that it's not inherently just
Yes.
doing a prayer or a meditation, but it's what the focus is. And as in your story, the idea of doing a prayer that is designed to make somebody a more moral, better person. Ultimately, there is truth to that. There's the hope that will ultimately change the way a person thinks about themselves, thinks about the world, and then changes their behaviors accordingly.
And the interesting also point here, Dr. Andrew, when you said, like, maybe if somebody gets to the prayer in the wrong way, maybe he imagines that he is going to be punished and everyone is going to be punished and everything like happens to me is just because Allah or God doesn't like me. So actually we have also tradition, one of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad that goes that way. The meaning of it is that Allah is going to give you according to what you think of him. Like if you think of him like he's raging and he's against you and so on, you're going to, that can have two interpretations. First one is you're really going to have this life like this, in this bad way, or you're going to see it in this way and you're going to only see the bad things. You're not going to see the good things.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. And, now I'm also a medical doctor. And, one of the intriguing things that I have noticed over the years is sort of observing two different kinds of people when they are confronted with something very bad, let's say the death of a child or the death of a spouse.
Mm-hmm.
Some people turn towards God and they say, God will help me through this. God will help me to find a way to cope and to deal with it. And I will now, turn towards my spiritual tradition. Other people turn away from God because they say, why would God, I'm a good person. Why did God take my child from me? And so, again, from the brain perspective, what's the difference? What's the difference that makes one person turn one way towards God, makes another person turn away from God? And again, as a doctor, as a healthcare provider, part of what I ultimately hope is that we can understand what those differences are and find ways of helping people to get through those issues and through those problems. So there might be ways of more effectively redirecting people back to God or to a different perspective to help them deal with these issues and problems in more effective ways. And so I think that is part of the process, which is to try to help people to understand where religion and spirituality fits into their lives, how they may engage that in ways that can be very effective, and if there are health benefits, so to speak, that's great. I mean, obviously, one does not become religious because they hope that that's going to lower the risk of cancer, but nonetheless, if it helps people to reduce I have a colleague who's done some wonderful work looking at religion in terms of being very protective, if you will, of adolescents in terms of dealing with depression and anxiety. Yeah, it's a scary world, and people are depressed and people are anxious about a lot of things going on today all over the world. So if religious and spiritual ideas can foster positive emotions, feelings of love, feelings of compassion, feelings of forgiveness, is another term we haven't talked about, then those are feelings that really can go a long way to help people. And if we can understand ways of trying to make that as effective as possible, I think that only can be beneficial and supportive of people.
You mentioned, Dr. Andrew, about like those people who have like calamities in their lives and what we can see from their brains and so on. Some people, they take the research, the biological research, and interpret that we are wired, or we are like the selfish gene hypothesis or view of the world, and I'm just made this way. I'm prone to being maybe against maybe God, or I'm prone to be a good person, or you can talk about various maybe examples of that. So where does consciousness play in your research? Like, do like people have really free choice? Let's say not maybe complete free will, but they choose and they have something to say, and they can really
Right.
interrupt the everything around.
Yeah. Well, you're bringing up some very interesting issues. So let me try to dissect them out, so to speak. One interesting question is kind of, how much are we kind of pre-wired, so to speak, to engage religion, believe in a certain way, and I would probably argue that just based on humanity and what I've observed throughout all of our research, is that there is this continuum, and there are people who people who come up to me after I give a talk and they say, I've tried every kind of meditation and everyone is better than the next. I just, they're all terrific and I feel good every time I do something different, and it's great. And then I have other people come up to me and say, I've looked at all these different religious traditions and I've tried meditation. I don't get it. It has no impact on what, sometimes they say, what's wrong with me? Yeah. And I say, well, look, we're all built differently. And sometimes we have to find that spiritual sense of ourselves in different ways. Some people may even find ways of engaging it outside of a particular tradition by exploring music or art or something like that. And of course, music and art is part of religions as well, because they're so powerful at inducing spiritual experiences. So I think that, part of the question is that, is finding the right key, so to speak, that unlocks those feelings for a given individual. Now, you mentioned the other piece of this, which is this free will question. This is an interesting issue because it has very profound theological implications. Obviously, if we do not have free will, then how can we be held responsible for the things that we do? On the other hand, we certainly act and feel like we have free will. Religious traditions, including Islam, have very specific ideas on the matter and making sure that it does preserve the notion of free will. There have been a very small number of studies that have looked at free will in the brain. And for example, what they typically find is that there is, interestingly, there are some areas of activity in the brain that occur a few hundred milliseconds before we make a conscious decision. And so, people say, well, then do we have free will? And so, this to me is like one of those perfect examples of what we talked about way at the beginning, that, we need science and religion to come together to look at all of this information. The studies on free will that find these areas of activity, okay, let's assume that the results are correct. But what does that actually mean? Where does our free will begin? Does it have to begin in our conscious mind? Going back to what we were saying a few moments ago, if it changes the way, if we do a prayer every day and it changes the way we are, then we may start to make decisions based on that new way of thinking about things, which are pre-conscious, but ultimately become part of the way I think about things.
So maybe you can differentiate, sorry to interrupt, Dr. Andrew, between maybe I'm getting to a dangerous place here because I'm not a specialist, but the point of maybe difference between potentiality and actuality, like maybe what happens in the brain, it's just the potential of this thing happening. And maybe this is what you're alluding to, Dr. Andrew, the Libet test, I think, or Libet experiment.
Yes.
So I think also it was related to, and correct me if I'm wrong, just very basic choices, like move your right hand or your left hand. It's not complicated like decisions in life, like maybe taking a rigorous exercise and continuing maybe for years and getting to a trophy or getting to like a certain university or doing your research, like what you did, the effort and so on.
That's exactly right. And so again, part of what we have to do is look at the science itself and say, okay, how realistic is this? What are the different aspects? And as you mentioned, it was a very simplified thing. Our brain is constantly interacting with the world. Things come in, we think about it, we act and behave outwardly, then things come back into us. And it is this constant cycle. So if there is a willfulness that gets inserted into those different, as much as our free will may want, we can't fly. Okay. We're just not aerodynamically built to fly. So, there are certain things that we can and can't do. And again, so there's sort of the what's possible, as well as what we actually can do. And I think that understanding these questions by using both the information that we can learn from science as well as the information we can learn from religion is our best way of trying to understand, do we have free will? If we connect with God, what part of us is connecting with God? Is it our frontal lobe? Is it our brain? Is it our body? Is it our soul? Is it all of it? And how do we understand that? And again, we have what religion has to say, but we now also have some information that we can also turn to, which it can, I think, enrich the discussion and not eliminate any parts of the discussion.
And maybe this point, Dr. Andrew, also comes to, like, even if the research tells me like I am determined or I'm programmed, I'm not going to live this way. Nobody is going to take this research so seriously to the point that, well, I'm going to live a blind life. I'm just going to wait until
Right.
life turns out to be the way it is.
Right. And one of the things that actually came out of that research was that even if we don't necessarily have free will, they quipped that we may have free won't, so we can decide what not to do. And even though we may want to steal something, or we may want to do something that is not so nice to a friend or a colleague, we don't have to do that, and we can go in other directions that are more positive. And again, that's where I think this neurotheology comes in, which is to say, okay, how do we redirect people in ways that are more positive, more conducive to making human beings a better place, better people, making the world a better place? How do we think about all these things? And again, it even comes into some of these larger questions affecting the world today, like climate change, and what's going on in the brain of somebody who says, absolutely, climate change is real and it's happening and we have to do something. And we have other people who say, don't worry about it, it's not a problem at all. There's a lot of different views on what to do. And to me, I think part of what's fascinating is to find ways of looking at these questions in a systematic way, where one, I can understand to some degree the biology that goes into thinking about things in different ways, but even more so, some of the recent work that we've done has involved doing surveys where, whether it's an online survey or we hand something out, and, wouldn't it be so incredibly valuable to just ask people the questions, to go to a mosque and say, okay, here's 100 people in a mosque. What do you actually believe? When we talk about God, what are you thinking about? What emotions come to your mind? Does everybody feel love of God? Do some people not feel love but feel awe? And as you mentioned earlier, some people may turn away from God or feel that God is angry at them. Let's ask the questions and understand, because I give a lot of talks, and I hope that when I talk, people understand me the way I think they are. But unless I ask them, I have no idea. So that's just another part of this, I think, which is to really more fully understand what people think, what they mean. You mentioned atheists, for example. When they say, well, I don't believe in God, let's ask them, well, what do you mean by that? When you say God, what are you talking about? A lot of times they think they mean, that most people believe that God is this, old man floating in the clouds. And I think most people who are religious don't think that anymore. So, we need to be on the same level in terms of our understanding of what people are thinking. And hopefully that fosters better dialogue and better communication among all people.
That's amazing. So what about the flipped argument, like Dr. Andrew, if we talk about the atheist brain, what does atheism do to your brain? What I mean by certain atheism is the atheism that comes to, I don't want to mention some names, but of course, them, Dr. Andrew, like they come with angry speeches and they talk about religion and they want to wipe out religion from every place, and they think it's like it poisons everything, and we have to separate, remove religion and we put science instead of it. So what about the brains? What happens inside the brain of an atheist who thinks like this?
Well, the short answer is we don't fully know yet. And part of the problem that we always wind up with is, one of the limitations of science is that we tend to look at things on a more population level. So how I would answer your question is I would bring 30 atheists into my lab, and I would bring 30 religious people, and I would look at the differences. But the problem is that there are some religious people who will look like an atheist brain and vice versa, and yet they still, believe the way they do. So there's always that challenge. But that being said, part of it, what we think at the moment is at least maybe two pieces of this, which is that one may have something to do with how people analyze the world and how open they are to accepting or rejecting certain things. And what's interesting about that is that fundamentally, it may not be that one way of looking at the world is truly better or worse. It's just different. And what I mean by that, and some studies have looked at this, for example, there was one study where they showed people who were religious and people who were non-religious these very blurry pictures. So they take a regular picture and they would make it blurry and they say, what do you see? Well, the religious people almost always saw the things that were really there, but sometimes they saw things that weren't there. On the other hand, religious people never saw things that weren't there, but sometimes didn't see the things that were there. Mm-hmm. So they both made mistakes in terms of looking at the world, but they just kind of do it in different ways. And so that leads to sort of how they look at reality. And one of so part of that may have something to do with how our frontal lobes look at the world and how critical we are, how analytical we are about things. The other piece may have something to do actually with the dopamine system that we mentioned earlier on. There's been a couple of studies that have looked at the fact that dopamine may play a role in terms of how a person looks at that reality and how open they are to other ideas and looking at things in different ways. And so, that also may be part of it. Now, you mentioned the other piece, which is, so when people believe in a certain way, why do they then become, very militant or very angry or very, very antagonistic to other people? Unfortunately, part of that is, we see that everywhere. So there are religious people who are very angry, and there are atheists who are very angry. And I am sometimes amused when colleagues of mine who are in the scientific realm think that science is going to be the way to answer everything. And I always say, well, how many scientists do you know? Because scientists can be every bit as nasty as everybody else. So, we'd like to think that there's some logical answer to everything, but there really isn't. I mean, we're human beings and we are emotional. And, part of what I've written about in some of my prior works is that I think where the antagonism generally comes from is that, if I believe one way and you believe a different way, usually my brain has a problem, right? Because if you're right and I'm wrong, that means that I don't understand the world well. And that would really trigger a lot of alarms in my brain, because if I don't understand the world well, then I'm not going to survive in this world very well. Mm-hmm. So it's far easier for me to say, no, I'm right and you're wrong. Because now my brain feels better. And I say, okay, no, I've got it. I've got it figured out. Now, the problem though is that I still have you over there saying something different than me. So a lot of times, at the beginning, I might try to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, but eventually I might start to get upset with you. And I might even start to think, well, gee, why would he be trying to tell me something that I know is wrong? He must be lying. He must be evil. He's a bad person. And so now I start to get angry or antagonistic and work towards, even the possibility of fighting you or trying to kill you because you don't believe the way I do. And so, but again, that's a universal that has nothing that comes into nationalism and religions and science. And, scientists have been every bit as nasty to people when they come up with new ideas as religious people have been. So I think it's a little bit a part of how we are as human beings. And I guess that's part of where hopefully the religious perspective of compassion and forgiveness and openness can play a role in trying to help people to be better people, and regardless of what their beliefs are. And, hopefully we wind up in a world where we can have different ideas and different beliefs, but still have these wonderful conversations and still appreciate each other's perspectives. The last thing I'll say about this is that, our brain is looking at about 0.000000001% of the universe, right? I mean, all I know about what's going on right now is this computer screen and my room. And yet somehow my brain convinces me that I know what's going on. And it's really quite remarkable that we can even get up in the morning. That, I mean, it's amazing that our brain seems to give us this idea that we understand the world around us when we have such a small amount of information. And so all of our brains are just doing the best job they can. And to me, if one person comes to one conclusion and somebody comes to another conclusion, that's just the way our brains are, and so, hopefully we just learn from it and appreciate each other and move on and try to help each other figure out a better understanding of the world.
That's amazing. Before the last question, I know that you have a meeting now with Dr. Andrew and time flight. So we have actually this notion in Islam also that some people in the time of the Prophet, they saw other people who were disbelievers. And they said they mocked them. Or they said, oh, those people, they don't believe in Allah. They don't believe that He is one. Like those stupid, they don't know the truth and so on. And there's a verse coming from Allah to the Prophet telling us, the meaning of the verse is that you were like them once before. So don't just be judgmental and just, you were in the same shoes of them.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And again, I mean, that goes back to what I feel is a fundamental element of the research that I do, neurotheology, the idea of we are sort of all in this together. We're all have our limitations. We all have, a very limited, finite brain looking out on a basically infinite world, an infinite God. And so, for us to have any real feel of what's going on or to feel that we understand it, that people sometimes ask me, what have I learned from doing all this? And I think kind of, apropos of your line is that it's an understanding that we are all kind of the same at one level, and we're all trying to understand the world. And so if somebody comes to a different conclusion, that doesn't inherently make them a bad person, but maybe I need to find ways of helping them to see, what I think is a better way of looking at things. And ultimately, if they don't, well, that's, I can control the way I think, and I'll let the world and God worry about the rest. So, there's only so much that each of us can do, and I think that it's fascinating, and again, I think this is where learning a little bit about how our brain works and how our brain helps us to think about our religious and spiritual ideas, that to me is a fundamental part of what it means to be human beings. And hopefully it teaches us about ourselves and helps us to be a little bit better and maybe to find some new enlightenment for all of humanity, a new way of looking at the world that where we all can be a little bit better with each other. I think we definitely need that.
Really honored, Dr. Andrew, to having you. And as a last statement from you, how can people go to see your books and buy your books, new releases of your books? Do you have
Sure. So my website is just my website is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. People can look at some of the books that I've written on neurotheology. We've started to expand looking at specific traditions a little bit more, and I very much hope to be able to do this with Islam as well as all of the traditions, and also just topics on neurotheology, as well as some of the actual research studies and the brain scan studies that we talked about. So certainly love to hear what people have to say, and to me, we're, like I said, we're all in this together. So we all have we all need help in figuring things out.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew. Very happy having you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Take care of yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let me know if you need anything.
Thank you. I really appreciated this interview.